probably agree on.
Yeah, the playoff team for sure.
So do you. I mean, I tell you what, I don't think there was a more accurate state. And
if they struggle again, I mean, I don't think there's any way you can keep Alex Critch. But
what's going on, y'all? I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on the Cover 3 podcast. Today, it's all NC State. For that, I always go to Pack Pride. My man Cory Smith joins us once again. Excellent last year on this. Let's run it back, man. How you been?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Doing well. I've added a few more things to my collection back here from the Final Four run, the ACC championship run. So a little different territory for NC State, but yeah, obviously we're talking football today. So
NC State just has a cool fan base, man. I like you guys. I love going to that stadium that now I'm blanking on the name, but like it's kind of like you walk through a forest and all of a sudden like there it is, depending on where you park. I'm like, it's cool. It's like it's like a little oasis, and I like it.
Yeah, it's as far as tailgating is concerned, it's kind of a hidden gem. I know a lot of people like the SEC spots, but man, getting to the fairground lot there, seeing the the sororities, the fraternities that are lined up along there, it's a lot of fun.
Man, no doubt about it. So, nice year for NC State last year. A little bit unconventional how they got there at times. Offense was a bit of a challenge, just literally offense in general. What was challenging, defense was just taking over games. The Louisville game in particular was absolutely insane how they're like, yeah, we're just not going to play offense for, I don't know, the better part of 50 minutes and defense just go win it for us. And they did. So this year, maybe hoping for a little more balance. I will start out by asking you, where is this team better than it was last year?
Well, offense. I don't think first of all, it probably couldn't have gotten much worse than where it was, especially at the beginning of the season. They kind of figured out like, hey, let's just, try to possess the ball for as long as possible, especially when Brennan Armstrong came back in. There was a lot of stuff that happened behind the scenes. Obviously, when you have a player that, you expect to be the guy with Brennan Armstrong last year and he's not. And then you put MJ Morris in there and he says, hey, we're going to redshirt after 4 games. And then you have to go back to Brennan Armstrong, who you basically told, hey, you weren't good enough. But now all of a sudden you're going to have to be good enough. The thing for this offense going into this year is you get Grayson McCall, a completely different style of quarterback than what you had last year. Obviously, he does have some of that dual threats, ability, but he's much more of a downfield passer, a guy that can, if you put the right weapons around him, can be somewhat of a game manager and then go out and win you a game when you need it. They did that this year. You get back Kevin Concepcion, which seems like, oh, well, you got a guy back. Well, in the transfer portal era, it's not easy to do that. So they get him back. The collective was a big part of that as well. Then they go out and they, basically keep the entire offensive line, add Zeke Correll at the center position. You get a guy like Noah Rogers out wide at the wide receiver position, which was a redshirt freshman last year with Ohio State. He comes back, a former 5-star wide receiver. Then you get a guy like Jordan Waters at the running back position that I don't think a lot of people are talking enough about. Came over from Duke, a former wide receiver that wasn't utilized nearly as much as a wide receiver guy that can, catch the ball out of the backfield. I think he's going to be a big weapon this year in terms of that. And then Justin Jolie, adding a guy like that at the tight end position, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about him, but what he's able to do, missing tackles, being able to make those contested catches, that's something that I feel like really, really adds to this team. The defense, they're going to have to take their lumps maybe a little bit early on. They do have some spots where you have to kind of work out, but you've got a guy like Tony Gibson that comes back, the 3-3-5 defense. They know what they're doing. So from a strength standpoint, where they strengthen, I would say just all across the board on the offensive side of the football.
Let's stick with McCall for a little bit. Just the guys that I knew on that Liberty staff when they were at Coastal, their mindset was always like, as long as we got Grayson, we got a chance. And his play diminished, some as his time went on there at Coastal. I think in large part due to injury, and obviously had a coaching change there at Coastal when that staff went to Liberty. What did you see from him this spring? What did you hear about him this spring? I watched the spring game, and there's the scene in Major League where everybody's like, "Who are these guys?" Like as far as who he was playing against, so I had a little like cool, like he looked crisp and it looked good. He's also playing against it looked like walk-ons for the most part in the spring games. Like on a day-to-day basis, what did you see? What did you hear about McCall?
Yeah, I mean, when you're playing against second or third teamers, you're going to look great. But everything we heard from spring camp and getting a chance to see him a little bit, he looked like a guy that had total control of the offense. I mean, that's the biggest thing that you can ask for. He's coming in, it's a completely new system. He had to learn a new system last year. He comes in, it's a little more familiar from what Jamie Chadwell was running previously over at Coastal before he went to Liberty. So this is a little bit more of a downfield type of system. He's going to have like I said, he's going to have a ton of options. I mean, you've got a guy out of the backfield that can catch the football extremely well. You've got a guy that, in terms of the outside receivers, you also bring Cory Collins back that I think is going to be a big role player for them this year as well. Wesley Grimes coming over from Wake Forest. So as far as what he's actually been able to do and show in this system, it's been, having control, having chemistry with these guys. And I think that's going to be a big part of what they're going to try to do this season, because you really needed somebody that can take control and again, he's not going to throw for just 8 interceptions like he did, over those 3 years that he had with Coastal, but you do expect for him to be a little more, I guess, careful with the football and not make as many mistakes as what you saw from last year.
So State ran the ball a lot last year. I feel like it has been it's weird to me because their strength program is crazy good, at least in my opinion. They always look super jacked on TV, and the defense plays like a bunch of just mutants. Their run game has not been like super physical and dependable in a couple of years. Is there a chance this improves this year?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, like I said, Jordan Waters, I think, was the biggest. I mean, one of the biggest additions, from a standpoint of what you get in the transfer portal. I would say the 3 biggest for them, probably Grayson McCall, Jordan Waters, Justin Jolie, in terms of what they can add to this offense. But Jordan Waters, you get a guy that has rushed for a ton of yardage over at Duke during his career. He's also a really strong back, and you get, like I said, 4 of your starting offensive linemen back from last year. I don't know if they'll necessarily be all starters again this year, but you have depth. You know that you have a pretty good stronghold when it comes to the offensive line is concerned. If you get Zeke Correll fully back for this year, which that's the expectation, he's cleared and everything sounds good for him, then you should have a good offensive line in front of him. The biggest issue for NC State, particularly last year, was the fact that Jordan Houston, a guy that realized he wasn't going to have the starting role, decided to transfer after 3 games, basically entered the transfer portal and said, I'm done. Michael Allen was the guy that they had high expectations for, and he didn't really pan out. A couple injuries and also kind of getting overshadowed a little bit by Kendrick Raphael, who is back this year. That ended up leading to him leaving the program after the Wake Forest game, didn't play in a couple games there too. So it was just kind of a weird mix of like not having enough guys, but also the one guy that you did have was a true freshman who ran a wing T system before he came to NC State. So he's used to, being used as that guy, but more used to being run on the outside as opposed to, running straight through the middle of a college defense. So I think with him getting a year under his belt, getting a guy like Jordan Waters from Duke, and then the kind of wild card here is Dalen Smothers, known as Hollywood Smothers, that came over from Oklahoma. He redshirted last year, ends up coming back home to go to NC State. He's kind of the wild card in this mix. Can he be, a big role player for NC State too? And what does he add to this system? So you've got a 3-headed system. I think the 2 primary guys are going to be Kendrick Raphael and then Jordan Waters. But you've got a guy in Hollywood Smothers that I think could really add a lot to this offense too.
Pass catchers wise, I'm really curious to ask about some of the transfers they took. The UConn kid obviously got Rogers from Ohio State. And Rogers didn't do anything last year at Ohio State. And normally that is kind of a red flag. I know it seems crazy to say a freshman, but like there's the whole year 1-0 theory that a lot of the fantasy football guys use where, if you're really a 0 as a freshman at receiver, you probably never go on to do anything, which I'm like, there should be an Ohio State receiver room exception for this rule, but everybody in front of you is like a legit, top half of the draft type pick. What have you seen from some of these transfers that NC State took as pass catchers? Because like last year, I felt like it was kind of Concepcion and didn't have to respect everybody else all that much, kind of.
Yeah, that was about it. The only other guy really in the system last year, Cory Collins, came on late, and I think he's expected to play a bigger role this season in the outside receiver role, along with Noah Rogers. And then you've got a couple other guys they'll fill those roles. Wesley Grimes is another one. Wesley Grimes, I'll start with him really quickly. He was kind of a third receiver option for Wake Forest. He was one that NC State really wanted early on, came from Millbrook High School here in Raleigh. So they had high expectations for him. It sounds like he'll play a pretty strong role this season, probably again as that third receiver, but maybe have a little more yardage in this system, given the fact that you do have Grayson McCall. You will have a little bit more of a prolific offense than what Wake Forest had last year. And then Noah Rogers, as you mentioned, I was told day one walking out there, everybody's kind of like, hey, look, we have really high expectations for him in the future. I wouldn't put a lot of eggs in one basket. Don't think that he's just going to come out here and be the guy. And then by the end of spring camp, everybody's like, this guy, he might be a dude. Like, he might actually play a pretty big role this season. He might be one of those guys. I think a lot of it for him was learning some of the bigger parts, because he's been just kind of a guy that's been able to beat DBs over the top, his entire high school career throughout all of this, and be a guy that's, not really looked at as, hey, he's got to be a better route runner or anything along those lines. His route running is coming together. His hands are really strong. So it does sound like he could play a bigger role this year. We'll see. We know what you have in Kevin Concepcion. He was a guy that, last year played a big role for NC State, whether it was, out of the backfield, whether it was out of the slot. He went out wide. He did everything last year. So I expect for him to be, to kind of play a similar role this year, not be used as heavily, because you do have a guy like Justin Jolie that's going to be playing that flex Y spot, is what we like to call it, flexy, just because it sounds fun, from Robert and I's system. So I do expect for him to, take on a little bit more of that role. We were talking about this before we started the podcast. One thing I wanted to mention, he forced 20 missed tackles last year. That was the most by any tight end in the country. Brock Bowers had 17. He was second in the country. He also had 12 contested catches last year. A lot of that against, the stronger competition they face. He forced 5 missed tackles against Tennessee last year, which is the team they'll face in week 2. And he was playing for UConn last year. So it wasn't like it was a hidden thing that he was going to get the football. And then again, like I said, the 12 contested catches that he made last year, NC State as a team had 16 last season. So if you had to put one guy in the system that really makes this thing work, the Aronde Gadsden that Robert and I had at Syracuse 2 years ago, or, all the guys that he had at Virginia several years ago that were able to play.
That's what I was just Googling. I was like, was it, shit.
It was a Dontavian Wicks that he had.
Yeah. And then they had the Jelani Woods kid too.
Yes.
Like, they would move around a lot.
That's going to be your Justin Jolie this year. That's the expectation for him. And then, like I said, Noah Rogers on the outside, playing a little bit more of that role. And the two guys that we're not talking about, Terrell Timmons, Jonathan Paylor, two guys that come in as true freshmen, both top 150 and 24/7 sports rankings. Jonathan Paylor looked at as a slot/running back guy. Their expectation is when he comes in, I mean, he's like built like a brick, what house. I can't say the word here, but that's kind of the kid, we saw him come in as a freshman at a camp, and he looked like the biggest dude out there on the field, despite the fact that he was only 5'9". He's stout. He's going to come in and play a big role too. And then Terrell Timmons on the outside, I think, probably tries to find a way to carve out a role too.
All right, so let's fast forward. It's about 6 weeks from now, but ultimately it's probably shorter once we release this. We're at AC Media Day. The voting comes out, and this guy doesn't get on the preseason All-ACC team, but you think the postseason All-ACC team, he'll probably be there. Who's that guy for you?
I mean, I guess I would maybe say Justin Jolie. I don't know, because I just feel like not a lot of people know a ton about him. And also the fact that, this is, it's the media vote preseason.
Right.
As far as that's concerned, if I were to pick a guy on the defensive side of the football, I'd maybe say Caden Fordham, just because of the role that he's expected to play for NC State this season. What he was able to do this past year, playing kind of on and off at times with a guy like Peyton Wilson last year. The expectation for him is to come in and be the guy this year. So I think if he plays that role to perfection and plays what a guy like Tony Gibson is going to be expecting from him, I do think that he's going to play a big role. One thing I really want to point out really quickly, I messed up the last one. I meant to say Terrell Anderson. I said Terrell Timmons. Terrell Timmons was the wide receiver that transferred to Colorado. Terrell Anderson is the top 100 wide receiver that's coming into NC State.
Perfect. we don't need to talk as much defense because I don't know, unless I'm crazy here. It's in my mind, Tony Gibson has sort of been that class of like Tony Gibson, Phil Parker, Narduzzi at Pitt, where unless you give me really good reason, I'm just going to assume that you will kind of feature at least a good defense, if not a great defense, especially relative to the level that NC State recruits. Where could this defense be special this year?
I mean, it's funny. We were talking about it beforehand, and I said, one of the weaknesses might be the defensive line. I also think there's a good chance the strength could be the defensive line if a guy like Brandon Cleveland ends up being that guy, just because of the fact that the way he played down the stretch last season. For those that follow NC State, his last 5 or 6 games last year were on par with what Aleem McNeil did at the end of his sophomore year, and as far as the PFF numbers are concerned. And then when you look at it, what he was able to do, where he's able to kind of move up in this spot, they basically said, all right, we're gonna make you our guy. They went out and got a guy like Chaz Wallace from Colorado that I think could be a good depth piece there. But between him and then Davin Van, that I think has all ACC potential as well at the edge spot for NC State. I say edge. I mean, it's the 3 down system, so it's not really an edge, but he's a good enough pass rusher to be able to make a difference there. And then Red Hibbler, that played a big role for NC State last year, one of the best pass rushers for NC State. I believe a stat came out earlier this summer that I think it was Davin Van was like inside the top 3 when it comes to the most QB pressures. Now again, he's also been there for 4 years, and this is going into his 5th, so there's a lot of track record for him. But I do think that could be a strength. And then also getting Aiden White back. Again, it's a question mark there because they get Aiden White back, who was an all-ACC guy the last 2 years. But at the opposite position, Brandon Cisse stepping in, is he going to be good enough to be that lead cornerback for NC State after losing Shaheem Battle from last year? So that cornerback spot could be really, really good for NC State too, depending on how good Brandon Cisse is this year.
What's a position battle that you're really looking forward to come fall?
I mean, all of the linebacker spots. Like I said, I think Caden Fordham is probably entrenched there. And then, Sean Brown has been good enough. But one of the spots that I really like, we talked about it beforehand. They lose a guy like Cam Riley that ends up going to Florida State. The expectation was going in, he was probably going to be their Sam linebacker. They moved Kelvin McBride over there. They moved Wyatt Wright over there. Those are 2 guys that I think will compete at that spot. And then the safety spots as well. Those, that rotation, who ends up fighting for that and who ends up getting there, in terms of, because Devin Boykin, we don't know if he's going to be back or be fully healthy before the start of the season. So there's going to be a lot of guys competing for that spot. Bishop Fitzgerald, they bring in Jihad Carter. Bishop Fitzgerald, formerly the number 1 JUCO safety in the country last year before he came to NC State. And then Jihad Carter, formerly the number 1 safety in the country last year overall, before he went to Ohio State and had the injury history. So does he come in? How good is he for NC State? If those guys pan out and that's your starting safety spot before you get Devin Boykin back, that's going to be a pretty strong position there too. So I think those guys emerge, those guys become your starters. And then offensively, I'm just looking at wide receiver, like who ends up becoming the top wide receiver for NC State, because again, like I said, there's a number of names, a number of young faces, brand new faces from the transfer portal. Outside of Kevin Concepcion, we don't know who exactly is going to be there.
This schedule's pretty friendly ACC wise. Now there is the game against Tennessee, which is probably the hardest game on the schedule. I would think at a neutral site early in the season. But from a conference standpoint, no Florida State, no Miami, no SMU, which I don't know how good they'll be, but I assume they'll be top half of the league. And no Hokies, who, if you guys have listened to the summer school we did with Doug Bowman of BTU Scoop, they return like every single person that's ever played for that program. So probably a good year to miss the Hokies. You also get extra rest for North Carolina following a Thursday night ball game. So I think this is pretty, or rather, right. You get a bye before the Thursday night game, so no short rest against Georgia Tech, and then you get a couple extra days rest to go play UNC to finish out the season. I probably need to ask a question, not just make a statement. This sets up pretty well for them, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty favorable. If you can get past September with, I would say, at least 3-1, say you win against Tennessee or Clemson, one of those two, it puts you on track to, at the very least, get yourself to the ACC championship game, because of the fact that, yes, we know there are going to be some tough games at the end of the schedule. Like you said, I think Georgia Tech is a sneaky one just because of the fact that NC State has historically struggled in Atlanta, and that game has fallen multiple times there at the end of the season. I think back to the 2019 campaign. I'm sorry, NC State fans, but Devin Leary really struggling in that game, and then going on the road to UNC or coming back home to face UNC, and they just get mollywopped there. So this is it's going to be a tricky into the schedule, but like you said, the way that it kind of shapes up for them to have a little bit of extra rest in between those games, they also get some extra rest after the Western Carolina game to start the season. That's on a Thursday, and then they'll have 8 days before they have to play against Tennessee the following week as well. So it shapes up pretty nicely there. I think the big one is going to be going on the road to Clemson. NC State's beaten them 2 out of the last 3 years, but both of them have been at home for NC State. They haven't beaten them at Clemson. So can they get over that hump? If they can, then I think they set themselves up really, really nicely to not only, again, get to the ACC championship game, but if you win that, if you finish with a 10-win season and you get to the ACC championship game, you put yourself in position for, potentially the college football playoff. Like, as crazy as that sounds for NC State to even be talking about, but like all these things have to go right, and you have to not stub your toe. So I do feel like, kind of the ceiling for NC State is probably 11-1. And then the floor is kind of probably 9-3. Like, if you stub your toe on one of those games late in the season and you lose the first 2 against Tennessee and Clemson, then, that's kind of where things would fall. But I don't see them losing more than 3 games this season. And that puts themselves in, again, in a great spot, even if you go to the postseason with a 9-3 record, to try to finish out 10-3. And that would be huge for what NC State's trying to accomplish, of getting double-digit wins, which, again, weird stat for NC State, which they have a ton of weird stats. The only time it's ever happened was in 2003. So you'd love to be able to get to double-digit wins.
Cory, enjoyed this as always, man. We're going to be checking out Pack Pride every day, watching all your coverage of fall camp and during the season. And obviously, if you're an NC State guy, you should as well. So appreciate it, dude.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me.